Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a medieval winter where food, not warmth, decides whether you see spring again. You wake before dawn, not because an alarm exists or because the day feels promising, but because hunger has its own internal clock. Your stomach tightens first, long before your eyes open. The cold is familiar by now, almost background noise, but hunger feels sharper, more personal. Like a question that demands answering immediately. You probably won't survive this winter if you misjudge even a few meals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and local time. Somewhere, someone is listening to this while night presses in just as heavily as it once did here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie still for a moment longer, wrapped in layers that smell faintly of smoke and old wool, calculating without numbers. This is what winter thinking looks like. Not math, exactly, but instinct sharpened by months of scarcity. You do not ask what you want to eat today. That question belongs to another world. Instead, you ask what you can afford to eat and whether eating now will make tomorrow harder. Medieval winters stretch endlessly, not because they last longer than modern ones, but because food does not replenish itself. Nothing grows. Nothing recovers. Every bite comes from something you stored, salted, dried, or buried months ago, back when the earth was generous. Mainstream historians agree that most medieval peasants entered winter already undernourished, their bodies thinner, reserves low, immune systems compromised before the cold even arrived. Winter did not starve people suddenly. It finished the work already begun. You sit up slowly, conserving energy even in movement. The house is quiet, save for breathing and the faint sounds of animals shifting nearby. Hunger sharpens your awareness. You smell yesterday's fire in the air, the faint sourness of stored grain, the dull, comforting presence of bread somewhere in the room. Bread is not food in the abstract. Bread is time. Bread is survival, measured in slices. You know, without checking, how much bread remains. Everyone does. Grain stores live in the mind as much as in sacks. You remember the harvest, the yield, the grinding, the baking. You remember how carefully the loaves were dried to keep mold at bay. You remember which loaf was baked first and must be eaten first. Historians still argue whether medieval households kept strict rationing systems or relied more on habit and experience. But the result is the same. Nothing is eaten without thought. You rise and move toward the hearth. Not to cook yet. Cooking comes later. Fire must come first, because fire makes food possible, and because warmth dulls hunger, just enough to make it manageable. A quirky but well-documented detail is that medieval people often drank warm liquids not for nutrition, but to trick the body into feeling fed. Heat could stand in briefly for calories. Your ancestors understood this without modern biology. They felt it. As you coax embers back to life, your stomach growls audibly, and you ignore it. That sound means nothing unless you let it. Hunger is not an emergency yet. It is a condition. You have learned that eating too early wastes heat, fuel, and food. The day must earn its meal. While the fire wakes, your mind drifts, not forward but backward, replaying the logic of winter survival. You remember autumn meals that were fuller, heavier, when bread was thick and stew had substance. Those memories are dangerous if indulged too deeply. Better to think practically. What is left? How long must it last? Who must be fed first if supplies run thin? Children. Always. The elderly, if possible. Adults like you absorb the shortfall. This is not written anywhere. It is simply known. A fringe historical theory suggests that medieval adults subconsciously slowed their metabolism during winter through habitual undereating, entering a state closer to semi-hibernation. Whether intentional or not, your body feels heavier, slower, adapted to less. The fire catches at last. A small victory. Light creeps across the room, revealing the day's first truth. You are still here. Hunger has not won yet. You have another morning to negotiate with it. Outside, the world remains frozen, hostile, indifferent. Inside, food waits, limited and finite, but present. You do not eat yet. Not quite. Winter has taught you patience. Hunger will walk beside you all day, but for now you acknowledge it. Nod to it like an old, unwelcome companion, and prepare to make it last. The fire settles into a steady, patient glow, and only now do you allow yourself to think about bread. Not eating it yet, thinking about it. In winter, bread is less a food than a system. It is storage technology, social contract, and psychological anchor, all baked into a dense, dark loaf that would feel more like a brick to modern hands. You cross the room slowly, because haste burns calories you cannot afford to replace. The bread sits where it always does, wrapped in cloth, elevated from the floor to keep dampness and mice away. You unwrap it with care, not ceremony. Ceremony implies abundance. This is accounting. The loaf is smaller than it was last week. That is not alarming. That is expected. Winter shrinks everything except hunger. Mainstream historians broadly agree that bread provided between 60 and 80% of daily calories for most medieval Europeans, especially during winter months. That figure is not poetic, but it explains almost everything. Bread determines mood, labor, health, and survival. Without it, meat means nothing, vegetables are irrelevant, and even hope feels negotiable. You press a thumb into the crust. It yields slightly, then resists. Good. Too hard means staleness approaching inedibility. Too soft means moisture, mold, waste. You have learned to read bread the way sailors read clouds. This loaf still has time. You cut a slice, thin enough to feel responsible, thick enough to feel human. The knife is not sharp, because sharp knives chip and break and are difficult to replace. You saw rather than slice, crumbs scattering onto the table. Those crumbs will not be wasted. Later they will thicken broth or be fed to animals, or eaten directly if things worsen. Nothing edible ever truly disappears in winter. It just changes form. You do not eat the bread alone. You rarely do. Bread is almost always accompanied by something, anything, that makes it feel like a meal rather than a concession. Today it is thin ale, barely fermented, barely alcoholic, mostly warm liquid with a memory of grain. A quirky but well-documented fact is that medieval small beer was often safer to drink than water, not because it was intoxicating, but because the brewing process killed pathogens. You drink it not to feel cheerful, but to feel safe. As you eat, slowly, deliberately, your body responds with a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. The hunger dulls, but only slightly. Bread fills space before it fills need. This is the quiet cruelty of winter food. It sustains without satisfying. You learn to live in that gap. Your thoughts drift outward, beyond your own table. Because hunger has a way of making you aware of others. You know who has more bread than you. You know who has less. Grain stores are not secrets. Everyone knows which families had good harvests, which fields failed, which barns burned. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were primarily cooperative or competitive in times of scarcity, but lived experience suggests they were both, often simultaneously. You remember the mill. Everyone does. The mill is where your grain became bread, but it is also where power quietly lives. The miller takes his share, officially and unofficially. A fringe historical tidbit, whispered more than written, suggests that millers were among the most quietly resented figures in medieval villages, accused, sometimes unfairly, of skimming flour, dampening grain to increase weight, or favoring certain families. Whether true or not, hunger makes suspicion fertile. The bread you eat now passed through that system months ago. Its existence is proof that everything went right enough times. The harvest was sufficient. The grain was stored properly. Rats did not breach the sacks. Mold did not spread. The mill functioned. The oven held its heat. Any single failure would mean this moment does not exist. You finish the slice and pause. This is the most dangerous moment. The body asks for more. The mind must say no. You have learned that the first slice quiets hunger. The second teaches expectation. Expectation is expensive. You wrap the loaf again and return it to its place, turning away before doubt can intervene. Outside, the day has fully arrived, pale and brittle. Work waits, because winter does not eliminate labor. It only changes it. You will tend animals, mend tools, carry water, all on fewer calories than your body wants. Bread makes that possible, barely. As you move through the day, you become acutely aware of how bread functions beyond nutrition. It structures time. Meals become markers. Morning bread, midday bread, evening bread. Each portion smaller than the last, each signaling survival rather than comfort. A light joke drifts through your mind, uninvited. If someone invented intermittent fasting in the Middle Ages, it would just be called Tuesday. By evening, hunger returns with familiarity rather than urgency. You eat again, another thin slice, perhaps dipped into a pot where bones once boiled and now only memory remains. This, too, is bread's role, to give substance to absence. When you lie down that night, stomach not full but not empty, you understand something fundamental. Bread does not defeat winter. It negotiates with it. And for now, the negotiation continues. The bread settles in your stomach as you step back into the cold, but it does not stay alone for long. Hunger, once awakened, starts taking inventory. Bread is the foundation, yes, but no one survives a medieval winter on grain alone. Not if they want to keep their strength, their teeth, or their temper. So your thoughts drift, almost automatically, to salt. Salt is not dramatic. It does not glow, steam, or smell inviting. But in winter, salt is power. Salt is time made edible. You return indoors as the light shifts, and your eyes move to the corner where the preserved foods live. This is not a pantry in the modern sense. There are no shelves of labeled jars, no reassuring variety. There is simply a space set aside for things that must last. Hanging strips of meat, darkened by smoke. A small crock sealed with fat. A sack that once held fish and still smells faintly of the sea, even though the sea is far away and frozen in your imagination. Mainstream historical consensus agrees that salting and drying were the most common methods of preserving meat and fish across medieval Europe, especially for winter survival. Fresh meat was rare once cold set in, not because animals vanished, but because slaughtering them too early risked running out before spring. Preservation was a way of pacing death. You reach for a strip of meat, hesitate, then stop. Not yet. Salted meat is not eaten casually. It is rationed with almost religious discipline. Every bite comes with a calculation. How long until the next one? How much strength will this give? And what happens if you misjudge? When you finally take a small piece, you do not tear it like a hunter. You slice it thin, shaving rather than cutting. This is another winter skill. Thin slices stretch calories and soften more easily in the mouth. The salt hits first, sharp, almost shocking, followed by a dense chew that reminds you this animal lived, worked, and now sustains you. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces as you chew. Some medieval households believed that overly salty food could ward off evil spirits during winter, when darkness lingered and sickness spread. Whether this belief came from folklore or simply from salt's association with preservation and purity is still debated, but it adds a strange comfort. If nothing else, the salt makes the meat feel purposeful. You wash it down with ale, again not for pleasure but for function. The liquid softens the salt, warms the throat, and fills space. You feel marginally stronger. That matters more than enjoyment. Fish enters the picture next. Not today, perhaps, but soon. Salted herring, dried cod, preserved eel. Coastal regions depend on it heavily, but even inland villages trade for fish because the church insists on it. Winter fasting days require abstaining from meat, and fish becomes the legal workaround. Historians still argue whether medieval fasting rules genuinely improved spiritual discipline or simply redistributed protein consumption in clever ways. You remember the fish as you remember winter itself, stiff, pungent, transformative when cooked long enough. Dried fish can feel like wood in the hand, but when soaked, boiled, and mixed with grains, it becomes survival disguised as tradition. As night deepens, the salt begins to assert its downside. Thirst. Your mouth dries. You drink more. Carefully, because liquid warms you, but also leaves you needing to relieve yourself in the cold. Winter meals are full of these trade-offs. Comfort always demands payment. Before sleep, you check the stores again. Not because anything has changed, but because reassurance matters. The meat still hangs, the fish is still there, the crocks remain sealed. You count without numbers, estimate without writing. Your mind becomes the ledger. Lying down, you feel the salt working its way through you. Muscles slightly tighter, blood a little thicker. You are aware, dimly, that too much salt is dangerous. You are equally aware that without it, you would not make it to spring. Medieval nutrition is a balance not between health and indulgence, but between harm now and death later. Outside, the wind shifts. Inside, the preserved food waits. Tomorrow, you will decide again how much of it you can afford to become alive inside you. You wake again with the same quiet hunger, but it feels different now. Bread and salt linger in your body like a low-burning coal. Not warmth exactly, but persistence. This is how winter eating works. Not satisfaction, not fullness, but a slow agreement between what you have and what you are willing to endure. Your thoughts drift toward what remains beneath the earth. Long before the frost sealed the fields, you or someone like you bent their back to pull up roots that do not look impressive when laid on a table. Turnips, parsnips, onions, leeks. Carrots that are nothing like the sweet orange things of the modern world. Smaller, paler, sharper in taste. These are not foods of celebration. They are foods of patience. You move toward the storage pit, cellar, or cool corner of the house where vegetables are kept. Not every medieval home has a proper cellar, but most have some solution. A shallow pit lined with straw, baskets buried under soil, vegetables layered with sand or ash. Mainstream historians agree that root vegetables were a cornerstone of winter survival for peasants, precisely because they could be stored for months without sophisticated technology. You lift a turnip and feel its weight. It is firm, cold, and faintly damp. That dampness is important. It means it has not dried out completely. A shriveled root is a warning. A soft one is a disaster. You sniff it, because smell is your first line of defense against illness. Winter sickness often begins with food that has quietly betrayed you. There is a small ritual to preparing roots in winter. You do not rush. You scrub them carefully, conserving water, but removing soil that could carry disease. Dirt is everywhere in your life, but ingestion is another matter. Some medieval medical traditions, particularly those influenced by Galenic humoral theory, warned that cold, damp foods could imbalance the body in winter. Roots were considered risky unless cooked thoroughly. Historians still argue whether these beliefs had any measurable health benefits or simply imposed discipline through fear. You chop slowly, hands stiff from cold. The sound of the knife against wood feels louder in winter, as if the house itself is listening. The pieces go into a pot with water, maybe a scrap of fat if you can spare it. Fat changes everything. Without it, roots fill space but give little strength. With it, they become fuel. As the pot warms, the smell rises. Earthy, slightly sweet, unmistakably alive. This is not the smell of abundance, but it is the smell of continuity. You stir occasionally, watching steam curl upward, imagining it warming parts of you the fire cannot reach. Legumes enter the story here too. Dried peas and beans, harvested months ago, sit in sacks nearby. They are hard as stones and require soaking, time, and fuel to become edible. But they are dense with energy. Medieval peasants relied heavily on legumes during winter, especially when meat was scarce or forbidden. A mainstream historical fact. Peas and beans were among the most common protein sources for non-elites in medieval Europe. You measure them by handfuls, not cups. Too many and you waste fuel cooking them. Too few and you feel weak by midday. You soak them when you remember, curse yourself when you forget, and sometimes cook them anyway, accepting the discomfort that follows. Winter digestion is not gentle. There is a joke, quiet, internal, that legumes are the medieval peasants' revenge on winter. The gas they produce warms you from the inside, whether you like it or not. You smile faintly at the thought, because humor, even crude humor, keeps the mind from freezing alongside the body. The stew thickens. Bread will be dipped into it later, soaking up both flavor and calories. You know this combination well. It tastes slightly different every time, depending on what you have left. But the structure remains the same. Grain, root, legume, survival, repeated. A fringe tidbit slips into your thoughts as you eat. Some medieval households believed that certain roots, especially parsnips, could improve mood during the darkest months. Whether this was placebo, seasonal necessity, or early recognition of carbohydrate comfort is unclear. What is clear is that warm food changes how you face the day. Outside, the land remains locked. Fields that once offered greens and grains now offer nothing but warning. You do not fight them, you respect them. Root vegetables are your compromise with the soil, what it allowed you to take before closing itself off. As the day progresses, you notice how the stew sits in your body. Heavier than bread alone. Slower, it anchors you. Your movements feel more deliberate, less frantic. This matters because winter labor is about pacing. Spend energy too quickly, and you pay for it in exhaustion that cannot be recovered until spring. You store what remains of the cooked food carefully, knowing it will not last long. Cooked vegetables spoil faster, even in cold weather. You plan to eat the rest by nightfall. There is no luxury of leftovers that stretch for days. Before evening, you check the remaining roots again. You rotate them slightly, adjusting straw, removing any that show early signs of rot. One bad root can spoil the others. This vigilance is part of eating in winter. Food management is as important as food preparation. As dusk settles, you eat again. The flavors are muted now, but the warmth remains. You feel it spreading slowly, easing the sharp edge of the cold. You know this will not last through the night. Nothing does. But for now, it is enough. You lie down later with the taste of earth still faint in your mouth. Roots, hidden for months, have once again kept you upright. Tomorrow, you will return to them, and the day after that, until the ground itself decides otherwise. Morning arrives again without ceremony, the cold already awake before you are. Your body registers it first in the joints. Knees stiff, fingers reluctant, shoulders slow to remember their shape. You do not open your eyes immediately. You measure the day by sound, the faint crackle of embers still alive, the breath of others nearby, the soft settling of the house as wood contracts in the chill. Hunger is present, but it is quieter than yesterday. The meat from the evening before still lingers, doing its slow, invisible work. Winter meals are not about rhythm. They are about after effects. You eat not to feel full now, but to feel less empty later. You rise carefully, minimizing wasted motion. The floor is cold, always colder than you expect. Shoes wait near the bedding, never moved far away. You slide into them without standing fully, a small adaptation learned over years. Standing still wastes heat. Motion, even clumsy motion, creates it. Your first task is always the fire, not lighting it, coaxing it. A mainstream historical fact, often overlooked, is that medieval households rarely let fires go fully out in winter if fuel allowed. Rekindling from embers costs less wood than starting fresh, and wood is survival measured in hours. You kneel, stir ash gently, feed it thin slivers saved precisely for this moment. Smoke curls low, hesitant. You breathe shallowly to avoid coughing. A cough in winter is not just discomfort, it is risk. Illness spreads quickly when bodies cluster for warmth. As the fire strengthens, you turn your thoughts to food again, not the meal itself, but the inventory. Winter eating is less about appetite and more about accounting. You check the grain container first. The level is lower now, noticeably so. Each scoop removed over weeks has left a visible slope. Grain is the backbone, but it is also finite. You calculate days subconsciously, adjusting portions without acknowledging the math directly. Next, legumes. Dried peas or beans stored in sacks, harder than stones when dry, forgiving only after long cooking. They are fuel-intensive, which makes them tricky in winter. You save them for days when the fire will already be burning for hours. Laundry days, mending days, communal tasks. Roots come next. Turnips, onions, maybe a few carrots if fortune smiled at harvest. Some are softening. Winter storage is a race against rot. You prioritize the weakest first, cutting away damage with a practiced eye. Mold is not an abstract danger. It is visible, tactile, judgment-based. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood spoilage through empirical observation alone or through inherited beliefs about corruption and imbalance. Either way, you know which foods smell wrong, feel wrong, or look wrong. You trust your senses more than theory. Breakfast is modest. A thin porridge, reheated from yesterday if possible. Reheating is itself a survival tactic. Food warmed twice stretches fuel. It also tastes better, softer, more cooperative. You add nothing extravagant. Maybe a pinch of dried herbs saved from summer. Thyme, savory, something that smells like a season you barely remember. This is not for nutrition. It is for morale. Winter eats at the mind as steadily as it eats at the body. You eat standing near the fire, rotating slowly like something being evenly warmed. Sitting too long invites stiffness. Standing too long wastes energy. You find the balance without naming it. Outside, the day threatens snow but does not commit. Gray light presses against the small window openings. You glance at them and feel no urge to go out yet. Food decisions determine labor decisions, not the other way around. You will not burn calories you cannot replace. A quirky tidbit lingers in your habits. Some medieval households believed eating cold food invited cold into the body itself. Whether metaphorical or literal, you avoid it instinctively. Even bread gets warmed near the fire before eating when possible. Later, as the day unfolds, you ration again. A small piece of cheese, perhaps. Hard, aged, sharp enough to demand attention. Cheese keeps well in winter and delivers fat without the salt burden of meat. It is not universal, but where available, it is prized. You break it carefully, not cutting cleanly, but snapping along natural faults. Tools dull in winter, you conserve edges. Even knives need rest. As afternoon approaches, hunger creeps back. Not sharply. Winter hunger is a low, constant pressure, like cold itself. You answer it with more grain, more liquid, more patience. Stews are thin now, stretched further than you would admit aloud. You think briefly of those who eat differently, monks bound by fasting rules, townsfolk with access to markets, lords whose tables bend under excess even in winter. The thought passes without bitterness. Comparison wastes energy. What matters is that you are still functioning. Your hands obey you. Your stomach, though quiet, is not screaming. Your fire still burns. As evening returns, you prepare the next meal with what remains visible, not what you hope is hidden. Winter rewards realism. You stir, taste, adjust, accept. When you finally sit down again, bowl warm against your palms, you feel the continuity of effort across days. Food is not excitement, it is maintenance. And maintenance in winter is survival. By the time the next meal approaches, you are thinking less about what you will eat and more about how long it will last. Winter shifts your attention forward, stretching your mind a few days ahead at all times. The future is not imagined in seasons or years, but in loaves, handfuls, and remaining hours of fire. Bread becomes the center of that future. It is not the soft, fragrant bread people imagine when they think of medieval life through paintings or festivals. Winter bread is dense, dark, and stubborn. It resists the knife, resists the teeth, resists even hunger to some extent. But it endures. And endurance is what you value most now. You touch the loaf before cutting it, feeling for dryness, for cracks, for any sign it has begun to turn against you. Bread in winter is often days or weeks old, baked in batches to conserve fuel. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval households baked only once every week or two, using communal ovens when available to reduce wood consumption. You slice carefully. Thick slices waste calories in chewing. Thin slices break. You aim for moderation even here. Everything has a balance point. The bread smells faintly sour. That is normal. It is made from rye or barley more often than wheat, grains better suited to poor soils and colder climates. Wheat bread exists, but it is not for you, not in winter, not most days. Rye fills the stomach longer. Barley survives neglect. These grains understand hardship. You warm the slice near the fire, turning it slowly. Heat revives flavor, softens resistance. Cold bread is technically edible, but your body protests it. The warmth matters, psychologically if not physiologically. You think briefly about how bread shapes the day. With bread, you can work longer. Without it, everything becomes tentative. Meat gives strength, yes, but bread gives certainty. It is the baseline, the reliable constant. Some households soak stale bread in water or broth to create pottages, thickened liquids that stretch both grain and warmth. You have done this often. Today, you decide against it. Water must be fetched, fuel spent, time allocated. Instead, you eat the bread as it is, pairing it with a small smear of fat saved carefully from earlier meals. Fat is gold in winter. It carries calories efficiently, keeps joints moving, gives food staying power. You ration it not by measurement but by intuition developed over years. Too much now means regret later. Too little means weakness before nightfall. A quirky belief floats through your memory, one you heard as a child, that bread baked during a full moon keeps longer. You do not know if this is true. You do not know if anyone ever proved it. But you remember your mother timing baking days carefully, glancing at the sky with quiet seriousness. Habits persist, even when explanations fade. Historians still argue whether medieval food practices were driven more by superstition or by accumulated empirical wisdom dressed in symbolic language. Standing here chewing slowly, you suspect it was both. Knowledge does not need to explain itself to function. As the day advances, you feel the bread settle in your stomach, anchoring you. Hunger retreats slightly, making room for work. You mend a tool handle, fingers clumsy but cooperative. You scrape ash from the hearth, saving it. Ash has uses, even in winter. Nothing is thrown away lightly. By midday, the light is already slanting. Winter days are short, compressed, impatient. You eat again, not because hunger demands it, but because timing allows it. Eating late costs more heat. Eating early buys stability. This time, the bread is paired with something sharper, perhaps a pickled vegetable saved from autumn, its bite startling after weeks of blandness. Pickling is another mainstream winter strategy, preserving nutrients and flavor when nothing grows. The vinegar or brine stings the tongue, wakes the senses. For a moment, you feel almost alert. Almost. You chew carefully. Your teeth matter more in winter. Dental pain is not just discomfort, it threatens survival. Softening food, avoiding strain. These are calculations you make unconsciously. The bread is tougher now, colder. You warm it again, rotating by habit. Outside, wind moves through bare branches with a sound like distant surf. You do not look out for long. The world beyond the walls is vast and indifferent. As evening nears, you inventory again. 1 loaf remains after this. 1.5 if you count the smaller round set aside earlier. You adjust tomorrow in your mind. Thinner slices, more liquid, less fat. The math is constant, silent. You remember a neighbor once saying that bread tastes better when shared. That may be true in summer. In winter, sharing is negotiated carefully. You will share if necessary. You will not offer thoughtlessly. When darkness settles fully, you eat the last slice of the day slowly, letting warmth fade gradually, rather than abruptly. Bread does not excite. It sustains. And in winter that is enough. As night loosens its grip and the next day creeps in without ceremony, you realize that bread alone cannot carry you through the deeper weeks of winter. It anchors you, yes, but it does not strengthen you. For that, you need something denser, something with memory of muscle and movement still inside it. Meat. Not the fresh, abundant kind people imagine from feasts and illustrations, but meat transformed by time, salt, smoke, and patience. Winter meat is not eaten lightly. It is planned, guarded, argued over in quiet tones. You reach for it rarely, and when you do, your hands move with a faint reverence. The small strip you cut today is hard at the edges, darkened by smoke, and smells faintly of last autumn's firewood. It resists the knife at first, then yields unevenly. This is pork, salted and hung months ago, taken from an animal slaughtered when cold first sharpened the air. A mainstream historical fact is that most medieval livestock slaughter happened in late autumn, precisely because cold weather slowed spoilage and animals became too costly to feed. You chew slowly. Salt floods the mouth, then fades into fat. This is not indulgence, it is chemistry. Salt preserves, fat fuels, protein repairs. Your body recognizes the logic instantly. The portion is small. It must be. Salted meat makes you thirsty, and water is work. It also reminds you of scarcity, which is dangerous for morale if indulged too often. You balance necessity with restraint. You hang the remaining piece carefully, away from damp, away from rodents. Mice know winter math too. They will take advantage if you allow it. Sometimes the meat is not pork at all. In coastal regions, it might be dried fish, herring, cod, eels stiff as boards. Inland, it might be beef dried thin, or mutton preserved in ways that make it stubborn and chewy. Freshness is irrelevant now. Reliability is everything. There are rules around meat that you absorbed without noticing. Eat it earlier in the day so digestion does not steal warmth at night. Pair it with bread or porridge so salt does not overwhelm the body. Never eat it alone unless you want to feel hollow afterward. You remember stories of families stretching a single animal across an entire winter, slicing thinner as weeks passed. Some even rendered bones into broth repeatedly, boiling the same pieces until they surrendered nothing but memory. Bone broth, though humble, was prized, warm, nourishing, and forgiving. A fringe tidbit surfaces in your thoughts. Some medieval households believed meat carried the temperament of the animal into the eater. Pork made you sluggish, beef made you stubborn, fish made you contemplative. You do not know if you believe this, but you notice how heavy pork sits in you now, how it slows your movements. Perhaps belief shapes sensation. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were protein deficient for the poor or simply misunderstood through modern nutritional lenses. Sitting here, wiping salt from your fingers, you know only this: meat changes how long you last. You reserve the fattiest pieces for the coldest days. Fat burns longer than grain. It cushions joints, keeps fingers responsive. You have learned, through bitter mornings, that a fat-poor diet makes winter sharper than it needs to be. Sometimes, meat is cooked into stews, stretched into pottages with onions, leeks, or dried peas, saved from harvest. Today, fuel is scarce, and the fire is weak. You eat it as it is, softened by proximity to heat rather than flame. The smell lingers, heavier than bread, clinging to the air and your clothes. This smell is dangerous. It attracts attention. From animals, from neighbors, from thoughts of tomorrow. You open the door briefly to let it drift away into the cold. Outside, the sky is a pale, exhausted blue. Snow threatens but does not commit. You breathe once, sharply, then retreat. By midday, the meat has done its work. Your hands are steadier. The cold feels less invasive, as if it has agreed to negotiate rather than dominate. This is the quiet power of winter protein, but with that power comes fear. Supplies are finite. You count again. Enough for now. Maybe enough for later, not enough to forget. You remember hearing of monasteries with cellars full of salted fish, feeding dozens through winter with disciplined regularity. Monastic diets were structured, measured, recorded. Yours is improvised, intimate, emotional. You are not feeding a rule, you are feeding yourself. As evening approaches, you do not eat meat again. You let its warmth echo through you, carried forward by bread and habit. Night will demand less digestion, more stillness. Before sleep, you check the hanging place once more. No gnaw marks, no damp, no loss. Relief settles softly, like an extra blanket. Tomorrow, you will decide again. By the time afternoon stretches thin and pale, you are no longer thinking about hunger in the sharp way you did this morning. The meat has dulled it, the bread has steadied it, and now another reality asserts itself. The land outside offers nothing back. You step toward the door anyway. The fields are there, technically, they have not vanished. They lie under frost and brittle soil, silent and unreceptive, like a body that has decided it will not answer questions today. In summer, you would be reading them constantly. Color, moisture, growth, promise. In winter, they are something else entirely. They are a warning. A mainstream historical fact sits quietly here. Medieval agriculture followed strict seasonal limits, and winter fields were intentionally left fallow, not from laziness, but from hard-earned understanding. Working frozen ground wasted energy and damaged soil structure. You were taught this without books, through aching joints and failed attempts long before you were grown. Still, you walk the edge. You look for what might still be taken without cost. A frozen turnip missed during harvest, a clump of hardy greens clinging to a sheltered ditch. Most days, there is nothing. Today, there is almost nothing. Which is worse, because hope burns calories too. You crouch, testing the earth with stiff fingers. It does not yield. It resists like iron, wrapped in dust. The cold bites through your gloves, reminding you that gloves are not protection, merely delay. This is the moment where winter teaches restraint. You could dig, you could force, but you do not. You learned years ago that winter punishes those who confuse motion with progress. Instead, you retreat, carrying back only the knowledge that the world is closed for now. Inside, the house feels smaller but kinder. The air is stale with smoke and breath, but it does not cut. You shift your attention to what can still be worked. Dried legumes, stored roots, grains that require nothing but patience and water. Peas, lentils, beans. They sit in sacks like pebbles, hard and unpromising, yet they matter enormously. Legumes were a cornerstone of medieval winter diets, especially for the poor, providing protein when meat was scarce or forbidden. This is not romantic survival food. This is arithmetic. You soak a handful in cold water hours before cooking, knowing that fire later will soften what time begins. Some believe soaking saves fuel. Others say it makes no difference. You soak anyway. Habit is warmer than certainty. A quirky tidbit drifts up as you work. Medieval physicians warned that beans caused melancholy and bad dreams if eaten too often. You smile faintly. Everything causes bad dreams in winter if you listen closely enough. When evening comes, you cook them slowly, combining them with onions dried into sweetness, a scrap of fat saved carefully for this purpose. The pot simmers just enough to coax them open. You stir rarely. Stirring lets heat escape. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants experienced chronic malnutrition during winter or whether their bodies adapted efficiently to cyclical scarcity. Sitting on your low stool, watching steam fog the air, you feel both arguments miss something. Hunger is not only physical, it is anticipatory. It lives in counting and planning and choosing not to eat. The stew thickens. It smells earthy, faintly bitter, deeply filling. You eat it slowly, not because it tastes complex, but because warmth stretches longer when respected. This meal does not excite, it stabilizes. You notice how it sits differently than meat. Lighter, steadier, without the salt pull. Your body relaxes into it, accepting that tonight will be adequate, not abundant. Outside, darkness comes early again. You do not check the fields this time. You already know their answer. You clean the pot thoroughly. Any residue left overnight becomes tomorrow's loss. You dry it by the fire, turning it carefully so no moisture lingers. As you settle back, stomach warm but not full, you understand something quietly important. Winter food is not about what you add to your diet, but what you refuse to waste. Energy, hope, effort. You lie down knowing the fields will wait. They always do. With daylight shrinking and your legs stiff from futile wandering, you turn inward. Outside, the wind scours rooftops and fences, carrying a scent of frozen soil and livestock. You do not go back out. The fields will not reward you, and your energy is now currency too precious to spend recklessly. Inside, you take up the quiet work that winter imposes with both patience and inevitability. Mending a torn wool cloak, sewing patches onto gloves, weaving a new binding for a bucket handle. Every stitch, every knot carries meaning, not artistry, not pride, but survival. Time is not wasted here. It is invested. A mainstream historical fact whispers through your actions. Medieval peasants often devoted half their winter daylight to indoor crafts and repairs, balancing maintenance against the unyielding cold and shortened days. You feel the truth of that as your fingers stiffen and the wool resists your needle. The fire crackles low. Smoke tangles with the chill that sneaks through unsealed windows. You have learned to tolerate discomfort as a constant companion. Still, you rub your hands, flex your fingers, and shake off numbness before returning to the task. There is rhythm in repetition, a small triumph in motion. Nearby, your children, or the neighbors. Children, depending on the dwelling's arrangements, watch quietly. Some ply their own tiny tasks, knitting, sanding wood, practicing letters if you are fortunate enough to have scraps of learning. Others nap, limbs tucked close, preserving heat and energy for the evening meal. Here you are reminded of a quirky fact. In some regions, children were known to carry small, sharp stones in their pockets to wake sleepy animals or themselves when drowsiness threatened outdoor chores. You laugh softly at the absurdity. You cannot imagine such a thing inside your snug though drafty room. Historians still argue whether peasants' indoor work was strictly necessity or evolved into ritualistic routines, part of a larger mental structure to survive the monotony. Sitting bent over a needle, you recognize the truth lies somewhere between. Your mind floats as your hands move. The day feels less harsh in its interiority. You rotate tasks, 1 hour for stitching, another for sharpening tools, a short pause to stir the simmering pot or check stored food. The intervals are both survival strategy and psychological padding. You have discovered that endurance is as much mental as it is physical. By mid-afternoon, shadows deepen in the corners of the room. You move furniture, cover gaps in doors with cloth, adjust blankets over beds or benches, attempting to conserve the scarce warmth. Each small effort is a negotiation with winter, a constant dialogue of give and take. You are neither foolhardy nor complacent. You are vigilant. Fuel for the fire becomes another focus. A small pile of chopped wood sits ready, measured to last until evening. You ration both heat and labor carefully, aware that overuse now could leave you shivering when night falls. Every spark, every ember, is precious. The meal you prepared earlier sits in a simple clay bowl, cooling slightly. You dip a wooden spoon and taste the stew again. It is less about hunger now than reassurance. This food is enough to keep bones moving, spirits steady, and minds slightly less restless. You sip slowly, savoring warmth that lingers longer than flavor. As the day wanes, you glance toward the window. The light outside has flattened into cold silver. The wind's howl is steady, almost conversational, a reminder that winter is constant and indifferent. The work you do indoors feels simultaneously monumental and trivial. Each stitch, each chore, a tiny defiance against the season's grasp. Your body aches with quiet fatigue. The muscles you used for outside labor are now recovering, but the hands and back you use indoors are taxed differently. You breathe deeply, feeling the subtle satisfaction of accomplishment. There is dignity in simply keeping life moving when nature insists it should halt. The room grows quieter as neighbors retreat, as children nap, as the wind fills spaces you do not. The fire burns down but leaves glowing coals, ready for evening cooking. You straighten your back, set down tools, and survey what has been done. The day's labor may seem small to an outsider, but here, in your cold corner of the world, it is everything. You are aware of cycles. Outside, nothing grows. Inside, everything you do preserves what is fragile: food, warmth, energy, morale. And in this, the rhythm of the winter day finds its own integrity. The brief glimpses you catch of neighbors moving through the frost-bitten streets feel like fleeting threads of connection, fragile yet vital. A nod exchanged across yards, a muffled greeting over a fence, the sound of distant laughter echoing faintly from another hearth. All of it binds you in the subtle network of survival. You notice that even in the harshest cold, humans find ways to remind each other they are not entirely alone. You step outside for a moment, bracing against the sharp edge of winter air. Snow crunches under your boots, icy fragments biting at your ankles. The frozen landscape is beautiful in its starkness, a monochrome vista that both dazzles and reminds you of the day's merciless passage. Historians still argue whether the medieval winter landscape influenced peasant social structures more than we can reconstruct from texts. Yet here, in the act of walking briefly among neighbors, you feel the importance of human presence. The smell of smoke from chimneys curls upward, a patchwork of scents: pine, peat, dried dung, all mixed into the cold, dry air. You inhale, aware that this smoke is both warmth and danger, comfort and hazard. Quirky as it sounds, some households would intentionally burn aromatic herbs with their fuel, believing it kept spirits, or illness, at bay. You chuckle quietly at the superstition as you wave to a neighbor shoveling snow from his roof. These shared absurdities create bonds as effectively as necessity. Inside, the rhythmic labor of repairs and mending continues. You rotate tasks efficiently, tightening rope bindings, sewing worn patches, trimming candle stubs, and resetting clay pots. Each movement carries a dual purpose: practical repair and the soothing of restless nerves. There is a meditation in repetition, a subtle mental warmth that rivals the fire's heat. You feel the psychological truth of medieval life. The mind must remain occupied if the body is to endure. The children peek through doorways, holding scraps of wool or bundles of straw, eager to mimic your actions. Their curiosity is a distraction, yes, but also a reminder that life persists even when survival is grueling. You guide them patiently, letting them pull threads and tie knots, aware that these small lessons will shape their ability to endure future winters. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Child labor, while harsh by modern standards, was integral to household survival. Children were essential contributors to the economy of cold, idle hours. Time stretches strangely. Minutes feel like hours when bent over small chores, yet the day's fading light reminds you that darkness approaches faster than your body might anticipate. You feel the wind outside as a persistent presence, a reminder that the world beyond the hearth remains indifferent to human toil. Still, you measure the day's progress in the small victories: the repaired sleeve, the replenished water jug, the fire that burns a little longer because of your attention. Around mid-afternoon, the cold settles deep into your bones. You adjust clothing, pull a scarf tighter, and shake out stiff fingers. Inside labor is not without its own perils. Bending for hours can cramp muscles already taxed by outdoor work. You pause, stretching and rotating, mindful that energy conservation is as much about preventing injury as about maintaining warmth. The peasant body is a finely tuned instrument of endurance. At this point, you reflect on communal strategies. In some villages, houses were grouped to share warmth indirectly. Walls of one structure could act as windbreaks for another, and livestock barns were often positioned to radiate heat toward living quarters. Scholars still debate the extent to which architectural planning, rather than sheer luck, dictated survival. As you glance toward the adjoining roofline, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, you sense both practicality and serendipity in your environment. Your midday meal has long cooled, yet you sip from a small bowl of broth, appreciating warmth and sustenance in equal measure. Taste is secondary, calories and heat are paramount. Even so, there is a quiet comfort in flavor, a fleeting indulgence that reminds you are alive, not merely surviving. Quirky as it seems, some peasants believed broth steeped with certain herbs could improve dreams. A trivial luxury, perhaps, but one you allow yourself to hope for tonight. A momentary silence fills the room, punctuated only by the occasional cracking from the hearth. You notice the subtle way light fades across walls, painting the space with muted shadows that mimic the skeletal forms of leafless trees outside. The aesthetic is unintentional, yet mesmerizing, a reminder that beauty exists even in necessity. You carry these observations inward, letting them soothe your weary mind. You check on the small stores of firewood and peat. The rationing system you employ is careful and deliberate. Waste is unthinkable. Each log, each bundle, represents hours of labor and a buffer against the encroaching night. The delicate balance between usage and conservation is one of the quietest, yet most consequential skills in peasant life. Here, survival is strategy as much as effort. As afternoon dwindles into evening, the rhythm of the household is marked less by labor and more by observation. You note the comings and goings of neighbors, the subtle creaks in timber, the shifting temperature as the sun's influence wanes. Each sensory note informs your choices: where to focus effort, when to rest, how to conserve. Knowledge is survival, and experience is its currency. At last, the faint glow of sunset paints the snow in muted shades of lavender and gray. You pause, considering the day's progression. So much has been accomplished, yet so much remains undone. There is a profound satisfaction in recognizing that the day was neither wasted nor trivial, that your small actions contributed to the larger fabric of life, warmth, and continuity. The chill that has been a companion since dawn begins to deepen as midday slips into afternoon, settling into your bones like an unwelcome tenant. You trudge through the space, feeling the cold press against every exposed patch of skin, a constant reminder that warmth is both a luxury and a fleeting victory. Even within the house, the fire's reach is limited. Corners of rooms remain shadowed in icy gloom. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants experienced more prolonged periods of hypothermia indoors than we assume, given the primitive insulation and small hearths. But you don't have the luxury to ponder it. You feel it acutely. You adjust your layers again, tucking wool beneath linen, tightening belts to trap precious heat. Each motion is deliberate, almost ritualistic, a choreography developed over years of practice. The weight of garments is familiar, like a second skin hardened by necessity. Quirky as it might sound, some families would stuff their sleeves or boots with straw, believing it improved insulation. A blend of practicality and superstition. You follow these customs without questioning, knowing that every bit of trapped warmth increases the chance of surviving the long night ahead. Outside, the wind has grown harsher, whistling through the cracks of neighboring cottages. Your eyes flick to the horizon, where skeletal trees sway against the sky veiled in slate gray. You can almost measure the cold by the way shadows stretch, creeping across frozen ground like dark fingers. The air carries a faint tang of frostbite, biting nose and ears, and you inhale deliberately, trying to draw strength from the crispness. The village feels isolated, a cluster of warmth clinging together against the indifferent forces of winter. Inside, you turn your attention to the hearth. The fire flickers, shadows dancing across walls, revealing small imperfections. A loosened stone, a draft sneaking through a seam in the timber. Maintaining the fire has become a strategic game, a careful balancing of fuel and attention. Each log you add is measured for its caloric output and burn duration. You understand that wasting wood is not just waste, it is jeopardy. A gamble with survival. Even mundane acts like tending embers carry profound weight. You glance toward the small supply of food. A thin stew bubbles in a pot, its aroma faint yet comforting. Even as the cold presses in, the smell of simmering grains and root vegetables evokes an almost nostalgic sense of home, grounding you in the present moment. You savor a small spoonful, appreciating warmth as much as taste. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval winter diets were austere, focusing on preserved grains, salted meats, and whatever root vegetables survived frost. Yet even minimal consumption could sustain the body through relentless cold. Children move quietly around you, their small forms wrapped in layers of patched fabric. They carry scraps, helping to stoke embers or fetch small bundles of firewood. Their faces are red with cold, eyes bright with curiosity and fatigue. You teach them the unspoken rhythm of household survival. Conserve, reuse, respect the fire, respect the wood. These lessons, repetitive yet vital, are as much about endurance as they are about life skills, ensuring that the knowledge of winter survival passes from one generation to the next. You pause in a moment of reflection, noticing the way shadows stretch across the floor. Dust motes float in the dim light, catching flecks of warmth from the fire. There is a quiet poetry in these small details, the interplay of light and shadow, the gentle crackle of embers, the rhythmic scuff of boots across frozen floors. Survival is not merely physical, it is mental, requiring attention to the familiar comforts, no matter how minor, that remind you life persists even when harsh conditions dominate. Your neighbors appear briefly outside their doors, faces half hidden in scarves, exchanging small gestures or a nod. These fleeting interactions offer reassurance, a subtle sense of community in the face of isolation. Historians still argue whether winter social networks were primarily practical or emotional, but for you, both dimensions are unmistakably present. Each acknowledgement, each shared glance confirms that the struggle is communal, even if the hardships are individual. By mid-afternoon, the cold seems to seep into every object. Metal tools chill rapidly. The floorboards radiate the day's frigid memory. You rotate tasks between tending to animals, mending fabrics, and checking food stores. Each action is both practical and a mental exercise, a strategy to keep body and mind engaged. There is a curious satisfaction in efficiency under pressure. Sewing a torn garment, securing a door against drafts, rearranging straw for better insulation. Small victories that cumulatively enhance your chances of survival. As the light begins to fade, the stark contrast between warmth and cold sharpens. You notice how your breath forms clouds in the room, the embers of the fire casting fleeting shadows over frozen walls. The day's energy expenditure is measured in the comfort of small spaces, the careful management of heat, and the unspoken awareness that night will test every precaution you have taken. Each deliberate movement, each attentive action, carries significance far beyond the immediate task. Finally, you take stock of the household as shadows deepen. You note the stacks of firewood, the simmering pot of food, the children wrapped and engaged in quiet work, and the faint warmth radiating from the hearth. These are the elements that define survival: planning, patience, skill, and an unwavering attention to detail. The winter is harsh, the night relentless, but through careful attention and quiet resolve, you manage the balance between endurance and life, moment by moment. The afternoon chill has settled into your bones like an invisible frost, a constant reminder that warmth is never guaranteed. You trudge from room to room, checking that doors are tightly closed and that straw-filled gaps between floorboards remain undisturbed. Outside, the wind howls through bare branches, rattling shutters and rattling nerves. You note the subtle ways cold penetrates every surface. The icy draft through the chimney flue, the frozen edge of the hearthstone, even the faint chill of a stone windowsill. Historians still argue whether medieval dwellings were truly effective at preserving heat, or if people relied more on clothing and body proximity, yet you know firsthand that both were essential. You shift your attention to fuel management. Each log is precious, and you pace the firewood like currency. You arrange and rearrange smaller twigs to maintain a steady ember, coaxing flames without burning through your reserves too quickly. A quirky medieval practice comes to mind. Some villagers would sprinkle salt or wet straw on embers to make them last longer. Unscientific perhaps, but any advantage is welcome in the long winter days. You admire the way smoke curls and dances upward, carrying warmth through the air while its scent reminds you of home, survival, and continuity. Evening shadows stretch across the room, exaggerating every crack and seam in the walls. You notice the way light catches on frozen surfaces, refracting in subtle blues and grays. Your eyes adjust, tracing patterns formed by frost and dust. There is a rhythm to this observation. The careful measurement of heat, light, and motion in a house that feels both fragile and stubbornly enduring. The children, curled in layers near the fire, watch your movements with quiet curiosity. They have internalized the balance between activity and conservation, learning the subtle art of sustaining warmth with minimal exertion. Food preparation becomes a central focus as daylight wanes. A simple stew simmers on the hearth, a concoction of root vegetables, grains, and preserved meats. Mainstream historical fact: winter diets were monotonous but calorie-dense, relying on long-lasting provisions to sustain energy through laborious days. You stir the pot carefully, aware that even a small spill or forgotten ember could diminish the meal's warmth or safety. Every movement carries intention, every glance is a check on survival strategies honed over years of repetition. The house itself is alive with quiet activity. Animals, tucked near the hearth or in adjoining pens, provide warmth both literal and psychological. You pause to observe a chicken huddled in a corner, its feathers puffed against the cold, and a piglet nestled against a bed of straw. You recall that livestock were more than food. They were a microclimate, living heat sources that transformed your home into a patchwork of comfort. Historians still argue whether peasant families intentionally planned layouts to maximize heat from animals, or if these arrangements evolved organically from habit. But in practice, proximity matters more than theory. Mid-evening, the wind grows insistent. You hear it rattling roof tiles, a steady reminder of the elements beyond your control. Each gust threatens to undo the careful arrangements you've made. Logs moved out of place, doors nudged ajar, flaps of cloth slipping from windows. You tighten every latch, check every straw-filled crack, and reinforce small openings. The routine is repetitive, yet it's necessary. Each precaution taken now saves discomfort or worse later in the night. The children, now quiet, engage in small tasks near the fire. One folds a patch of wool, another tends embers with a diminutive poker. Their small hands mimic your gestures, a silent apprenticeship in survival. The room's warmth rises slowly, a fragile bubble within the larger winter landscape. Quirky as it may seem, some families would even have sleeping rotations, using shared body heat to maintain warmth across the household, a practical intimacy born of necessity, not sentiment. You take a moment to reflect on the day's efforts. The house, humble and drafty as it may be, stands resilient against the cold. Every log placed, every gap stuffed, every chore completed has contributed to a delicate equilibrium. Outside, snow might be settling. Inside, warmth ebbs and flows, a living negotiation between your will and nature's indifference. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants viewed these routines purely as survival or imbued them with cultural ritual, yet you experience both, the pragmatics of enduring cold and the quiet satisfaction of mastery over your environment. The stew is ready, the fire steady, and the household begins to transition toward evening routines. You call the children to share in the meal, appreciating both nourishment and the warmth of gathered presence. Each mouthful, though simple, carries significance. It sustains, it comforts, and it fortifies against the relentless cold. Small successes, measured in heat, calories, and coordinated effort, define the quality of life through winter's harshness. Finally, as daylight fades into a muted gray twilight, you check the perimeter one last time. Doors are secured, embers stable, animals settled. The house, modest and worn, remains a bastion against the season's trials. You feel the satisfaction of routines well practiced, knowing the night will be long but manageable, guided by careful preparation and the collective resilience of all who share the space. The night stretches on, and with it comes the familiar awareness that warmth alone is not enough. As the fire settles into a dependable glow and the house exhales into quiet, your thoughts drift, inevitably, to food. Not tonight's stew, already scraped clean from wooden bowls, but tomorrow's meals, and the next week's, and the long gray stretch of days when winter refuses to loosen its grip. You lie awake knowing that survival in this season is not measured in feasts, but in margins. Historians still argue whether medieval winters were truly as starving as later folklore suggests. But you live in the truth between extremes. Not constant famine, not comfort either, just careful arithmetic. Morning arrives reluctantly. Pale light seeps through oiled cloth stretched over the window frame, turning the room the color of watered milk. You rise stiffly, joints protesting, and pull on yesterday's clothes, which never fully dried from body heat alone. The first task is always the same: check stores. You open the wooden chest where sacks of grain rest under linen, run your fingers through barley and rye, feeling for damp or rot. This is mainstream historical fact. Most medieval households depended on grain as their primary winter calorie source, eaten as bread, pottage, or gruel. You count days not by calendars, but by how quickly these grains disappear. Bread, once abundant after harvest, has become something more cautious now. You bake less often, stretching flour with ground peas or beans, darkening loaves until they are dense enough to serve as doorstops. Useful, honestly, if the wind gets ideas. You slice carefully, each portion thin, and you notice how chewing takes longer, as if the body itself is trying to savor time. There is no butter today. That was gone weeks ago, churned, salted, and consumed early when spirits were higher. What remains is endurance food, the kind that fills the stomach without exciting the soul. You hang a small pot over the fire and add water, grain, and a handful of dried herbs. This is pottage again, always pottage, winter's greatest hit. Sometimes it includes bits of salt pork, sometimes dried fish, sometimes nothing more than onions and hope. A quirky but real medieval habit floats through your mind. Some households kept a perpetual pottage, never fully emptying the pot, just adding new ingredients daily. From a modern standpoint, it sounds like a microbial crime scene, but boiled daily, it worked, mostly. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or an exaggeration by later writers, but the idea makes sense when fuel and food are both scarce. As the pot simmers, you step outside despite the cold, boots crunching over frozen earth. The garden is lifeless now, save for a few stubborn leeks and cabbages protected under straw. You pull one free, its roots snapping with a sound like breaking chalk. These overwintered vegetables are lifelines, and you treat them with a quiet respect. You remember autumn's frantic labor, salting, drying, smoking, how it felt endless then. Now you understand why. Winter does not reward improvisation. Inside again, you slice the cabbage finely, stretching its presence across meals. Cabbage appears everywhere in winter, boiled, stewed, fermented. Mainstream fact: sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables were common in medieval Europe, providing crucial nutrients when fresh produce vanished. You may not know the word vitamin, but your body understands the difference between sickness and survival. The sour bite wakes your senses, a sharpness that briefly cuts through the monotony. Midday brings hunger that is not desperate, but persistent, like a background hum you can't turn off. You ration carefully, saving denser foods for evening when the cold presses harder. Dried apples make an appearance, leathery and brown, their sweetness faint but welcome. They remind you of warmer days, which feels mildly rude of them, but you eat them anyway. A small joke crosses your mind. If winter had a personality, it would absolutely hoard all the joy and sell it back in tiny portions. Children ask when there will be meat again. You answer honestly, not today. Salted pork hangs from a beam, but it is guarded like treasure. Meat is insurance, not indulgence. When you do cut a piece, you shave it thin, flavoring the pot more than feeding bodies directly. This technique, using meat as seasoning rather than substance, is historically documented and deeply practical. Fat carries flavor, and flavor carries morale, which turns out to be almost as important as calories. Afternoon drags. You busy yourself with repairs, grinding grain, mending sacks. These tasks burn energy, which feels ironic given how carefully you guard intake. Stillness is tempting but dangerous. Cold creeps in faster when you stop moving. You snack on bread crusts dipped in broth, a small mercy. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you wonder whether people in the future will romanticize this simple living, they'll call it, while sitting next to a heater with snacks on demand. You allow yourself a quiet snort at the thought. As dusk approaches, you consider the calendar not as dates, but as phases of winter hunger. Early winter is manageable. Stores are full, spirits relatively intact. Late winter is the real test. This is the hungry gap, when supplies thin and the earth offers nothing in return. Historians still argue whether the hungry gap caused more deaths than disease, but there is no debate in your stomach. You plan ahead now, combining meals, skipping what you can, saving what you must. Supper is modest. Thickened pottage, a heel of bread, a spoonful of fermented cabbage. You eat slowly, deliberately. The children are quieter now, tired in a way that is more than physical. You tell a small story as you eat, not a grand tale, just something familiar. Storytelling costs nothing and fills space no food can reach. This, too, is survival. Night settles again. You bank the fire and think about tomorrow's pot, tomorrow's portions. You fall asleep not full, not starving, but balanced on a narrow ridge between the two. Winter continues, indifferent and patient. So do you. You wake again before the sun, not because you want to, but because hunger has a way of nudging consciousness long before light does. It is not sharp pain, nothing so dramatic, but a dull awareness. A reminder that the body keeps its own schedule regardless of how tired you feel. The house is quiet. The fire has collapsed into ash, and the air carries that particular winter stillness that feels thicker indoors than out. You lie there for a moment, measuring whether getting up will burn more energy than staying still. This calculation, small and constant, has become second nature. Eventually you rise. Movement is stiff, almost ceremonial, as if your joints must be persuaded rather than commanded. You wrap yourself tighter and move toward the hearth, coaxing life from yesterday's embers. Fire comes first. It always does. Food can wait, but cold does not negotiate. Once the flame steadies, you allow yourself to think about breakfast, not as a meal, but as a strategy. Morning food in winter is deliberately unimpressive. You ladle out yesterday's pottage, thickened overnight, and add hot water to stretch it further. This is a mainstream historical reality. Medieval winter diets leaned heavily on leftovers, diluted and repurposed, not out of laziness but efficiency. Every grain saved is a grain that might matter later. You stir slowly, watching steam rise, feeling an odd comfort in the repetition. Routine, at least, is predictable. You eat standing, partly to stay warm, partly because chairs feel like invitations to stop moving altogether. Bread appears again, darker than bread should be, but filling. You notice how taste has become secondary. Texture, warmth, and weight matter more now. Sweetness is rare enough to feel suspicious. You remember apples, honey, berries, foods that belong to another version of the year. Winter teaches selective memory. Once the meal is finished, you do not linger. Daylight is short, and winter demands that you spend it wisely. Today's concern is inspection of stores, tools, and the house itself. You check the hanging meat, pressing it gently to ensure it has not spoiled. Salted pork smells sharp but clean. A good sign. Historians still argue whether medieval salting techniques were consistently effective or wildly variable by region, but your nose is the final authority here. You trust it more than any theory. You turn next to dried fish hard as wood, destined for soaking and slow cooking later in the week. Fish was a winter staple for many communities, especially inland ones relying on preserved river catches. It is not exciting food, but it is dependable. You make a mental note of how many pieces remain, subtracting days automatically. This mental ledger never truly closes. Outside, the cold has sharpened overnight. Frost clings to everything, turning the village into a study in white and gray. You move carefully, knowing that injury now would be catastrophic. A twisted ankle is not an inconvenience, it is a sentence. You collect more firewood, choosing smaller pieces that will burn hot and fast. Large logs are saved for the deepest cold, the nights when sleep becomes negotiation rather than rest. Mid-morning brings the faint sound of life beyond your own household. A neighbor passes, bundled beyond recognition, exchanging a nod that says everything and nothing. There is comfort in knowing others are enduring the same arithmetic. Community in winter is quieter, less social, but no less important. You may not share meals often, but you share understanding. That counts. Back inside, you prepare the midday food early, knowing energy fades as the day wears on. Today you decide to sacrifice a sliver of pork fat. Not much, just enough to change the smell of the pot. The reaction is immediate. Steam carries something richer now, and you feel spirits lift in response. This is not indulgence, it is morale management. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces in your mind. Medieval cooks often prioritized smell as much as taste, believing good aromas strengthened the body. Whether scientifically sound or not, the effect is real enough. You eat slowly again, seated this time, savoring the rare presence of fat. Conversation is minimal. Winter has a way of trimming speech down to essentials. Afterward, you scrape bowls thoroughly, returning residue to the pot. Nothing is wasted. Not out of virtue, but necessity. You think of future centuries, of waste becoming normal, and the thought feels unreal, like imagining flying without wings. The afternoon stretches long and dim. You mend sacks again, reinforce the door with extra cloth, and press straw into cracks where wind insists on entering. These small acts of maintenance are as important as eating. Cold drains calories invisibly, and every draft sealed is food saved. Historians still argue how effective medieval insulation methods truly were, but you know this much. The house feels different afterward. Quieter. Warmer. As daylight begins its early retreat, you assess your body. Fatigue sits heavy but manageable. Hunger is present but controlled. This balance is the goal, not comfort, just stability. You prepare the evening meal with intention, combining what remains from earlier with water and vegetables. Again, cabbage. Again, grain. Again, survival disguised as dinner. Night falls fully now, and with it comes reflection. You think about how winter food shapes the mind. There is less variety, fewer surprises. Life narrows. And yet, within that narrowness, you find focus. Each meal eaten, each day endured, is a quiet victory. No one records it. No one celebrates it. But it matters all the same. You lie down later, stomach warm but not full, listening to the house settle. Tomorrow's food already waits in your thoughts, lined up like tasks that never truly end. Winter continues its slow work. So do you. The evening does not end with the last bite. Food in winter continues to exist even after it is eaten, lingering in the warmth of your stomach, in the smell of the hearth, in the calculations that immediately begin about what remains. You settle closer to the fire, not because you are cold yet, but because this is the moment to hold on to heat while it is still generous. Outside, the dark presses against the walls, patient and absolute. Tonight, your thoughts drift toward the calendar rather than the cupboard. Winter eating is never just about availability. It is also about permission. The church looms quietly over every meal, dictating when you may eat meat, when you must abstain, and when hunger is not just endured but encouraged. This is a mainstream historical reality. Medieval diets were profoundly shaped by religious fasting rules, especially in winter, when Lent-like restrictions appeared with unsettling frequency. You do not argue theology, you adapt. Tomorrow is a fast day. That knowledge changes how you feel tonight. You allow yourself one more mouthful of broth, slightly richer than planned. Not indulgence, preparation. On fast days, meat disappears, fat becomes forbidden, and fish once again takes center stage. Salted herring, dried cod, eel if fortune has smiled. These are not luxuries, they are compromises. You remember how strange it felt the first time you learned that fish didn't count as meat. Even now, the logic feels flexible, but no one questions it aloud. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed fish was categorically different, or simply accepted the rule because it existed. For you, the distinction matters only in practice. Fish means protein. Protein means survival. Before sleep, you prepare. Dried fish is set to soak, weighted down with a stone, so it stays submerged. This quiet act feels almost ritualistic. Water softens what salt has hardened. Time does its slow work. Tomorrow's meal begins now. You wash your hands carefully, aware that illness in winter spreads quickly, and the body has little reserve for mistakes. As you lie down, you think about feast days too, their rarity, their power. Christmas is the obvious one, though it has already passed, leaving behind memories of fuller bowls and shared meat. Those days feel almost unreal now, like dreams that visited briefly and moved on. Feast food lingers in memory longer than in storage. You recall roasted meat, spiced ale, bread that felt soft instead of dense. These recollections are not torture. They are fuel of a different kind. Sleep comes in fragments. You wake once, then again, adjusting your position to keep warmth where it belongs. Hunger does not wake you tonight, perhaps because the body knows tomorrow will be leaner and chooses rest while it can. When morning arrives, it does so quietly, without ceremony. You rise into the fast day with practiced restraint. Breakfast is thin broth, mostly hot water with grain whispers floating inside. You sip it slowly, drawing out the experience. Eating fast would feel wasteful. The body adapts to rhythm, and winter teaches patience better than any sermon. Mid-morning labor resumes, but energy feels different today. Lighter, slightly hollow. You move more deliberately, conserving strength. This is another historical truth. Fasting was as much a physical experience as a spiritual one, and in winter, its impact was magnified. Some scholars suggest that medieval fasting unintentionally trained bodies for endurance. Others argue it simply added stress to already strained lives. You feel both perspectives in your bones. By midday, the soaked fish is ready. You cook it slowly, adding herbs saved from summer, fennel perhaps, or dried onion greens. The smell is sharp but familiar. You eat without enthusiasm, but with appreciation. This food will not delight, but it will sustain. That is enough. The afternoon stretches on, quieter than yesterday. Hunger becomes a background hum rather than a sharp signal. You occupy your hands with simple tasks, cleaning tools, sorting grain, checking the roof from inside for leaks. Food scarcity sharpens attention. You notice things you might otherwise ignore. As evening approaches, you prepare the final meal of the fast day. More fish, more grain, more water. The repetition is almost meditative. You eat by firelight, shadows dancing along the walls, and think about how winter food narrows life without erasing meaning. There is dignity in endurance, even if no one names it. Before sleep, you allow yourself a small comfort, a sip of weak ale, barely fermented, more liquid than drink. It warms without breaking rules. A loophole, perhaps, but an accepted one. Medieval life is full of these quiet negotiations between doctrine and necessity. You lie down knowing tomorrow will allow meat again, even if only a little. The cycle continues. Fast, feast, endure, repeat. Winter is not one long deprivation, but a pattern of restraint and release. You breathe slowly, letting that thought settle. Food will return. It always does, in some form. For now, this is enough. Morning arrives with a subtle shift rather than a clear beginning. You sense it before you see it. The fire has faded to a red memory. The air feels sharper, and your body wakes itself because hunger has decided it has waited long enough. The fast is over. Not in a dramatic way, not with bells or announcements, but with permission quietly restored. That knowledge settles into you like warmth. You rise slowly, joints stiff from cold, and yesterday's restraint. The first task is the hearth. Always the hearth. You coax flame from yesterday's embers, feeding it splinters and breath, until heat returns to the room in cautious increments. This ritual never changes, but today it feels different. You are allowed more. That alone lifts your mood more effectively than sleep ever could. Breakfast reflects the shift. A small portion of meat, salt pork, shaved thin, is added to the pot. Not enough to feel extravagant, just enough to transform broth into something richer, something that clings slightly to the tongue. This is a mainstream historical fact of medieval winter eating. Meat was rarely consumed in large quantities by peasants, but small additions of animal fat or flesh dramatically increased caloric value. You savor it without ceremony. The smell fills the space, and you notice how it changes everything. Even the walls seem warmer. You eat deliberately, aware that indulgence now could create regret later. Winter punishes waste swiftly. Still, you allow yourself to enjoy the texture, the contrast between grain-softened broth and the firmness of meat. This is what sustenance feels like when it borders on pleasure. As the day unfolds, you think about preservation again, not as an abstract concept, but as the foundation of survival. Everything you eat now is something that once required foresight. Salted meat, smoked fish, dried legumes, stored grain. Medieval winters are survived months earlier, in autumn labor and careful planning. Historians still argue whether most peasants truly achieved caloric sufficiency in winter or lived in a constant state of near deficit. You suspect the answer shifts year by year. Mid-morning work feels easier today. Strength returns incrementally, fueled by protein. You repair a fence rail, then check traps set along the tree line. Trapping is winter's quiet supplement, not a feast, but a possibility. A rabbit today could mean variety tomorrow. You find nothing this time. Only disturbed snow and a crow's tracks. But even checking feels hopeful. Back indoors, you turn your attention to stores. This is the moment for inventory, for honesty. You count sacks of grain, feel their weight, estimate how many meals remain. Grain is life in winter. Bread may not always be baked, but porridge never disappears. You run your fingers through barley and rye, noting dryness, checking for pests. A spoiled sack is not an inconvenience. It is a threat. You recall a fringe tidbit once shared by a traveling friar. In some regions, people mixed ground acorns into grain during harsh winters. The bitterness never fully vanished, but it stretched supplies. You have done this once, during a particularly lean year. You hope not to repeat it. The taste lingers longer in memory than hunger does. At midday, the meal is simple but steady. More broth, thicker now. A heel of bread, dense and dark. You dip it slowly, letting it absorb heat. Eating is no longer rushed. Winter teaches pacing. The body responds best to regularity, not abundance. You feel grounded by this rhythm, even comforted. The afternoon brings communal echoes. A neighbor passes, exchanging a few words about weather, about stores, about rumors of scarcity elsewhere. These conversations are not gossip. They are information networks. Knowing who is struggling helps everyone adjust. Sharing may come later, but awareness comes first. As daylight fades, you prepare for the evening meal with intention. This one matters most. Night burns calories invisibly, and sleep demands fuel. You add more fat to the pot, scraping the last from a jar. Fat is precious. It is warmth in edible form. Medieval people understood this instinctively, even without modern nutrition language. You eat by firelight again, but tonight there's a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not fullness, never that, but balance. The body feels steady. Hunger is distant, manageable. You lean back, listening to the fire crackle, and think about tomorrow. There will be another fast soon, another cycle, but for now, you are fed. Before sleep, you set aside a portion for morning. Planning ahead reduces anxiety. This, too, is part of eating in winter, mental nourishment. You lie down knowing what awaits you when you wake. That knowledge is almost luxurious. Sleep comes easier tonight. The cold still exists, pressing in from every direction, but your body holds heat better when fed. You drift off with the faint taste of meat still present, a reminder that endurance is not just about surviving deprivation, but about recognizing and honoring the moments when survival feels almost gentle. You wake again in darkness, but this time the hunger feels different. It is quieter, less urgent, more like a polite knock than a demand. Last night's meal did its work well. Your body carries warmth forward, storing it carefully, like a cautious steward managing a dwindling treasury. The fire is nearly gone. You rebuild it slowly, respecting the balance between heat and fuel. Wood is never burned casually in winter. Each log represents future nights, future mornings when your fingers will ache and your breath will fog the room. Medieval households treated firewood as currency, and you handle it with the same seriousness you would coins. Breakfast is modest. Yesterday's saved portion, reheated. The flavor has deepened overnight, the fats congealing slightly before melting again. This reuse is intentional. Medieval winter food is rarely about freshness. It is about continuity. Stews and pottages often simmered for days, replenished rather than replaced. This practice reduced waste and preserved nutrients. Historians still argue whether such perpetual stews posed health risks, but they undeniably sustained communities through scarcity. You eat standing near the hearth, absorbing heat while calories enter your system. It is efficient. You have learned to combine actions whenever possible. Winter punishes inefficiency. The day's work is lighter today, by necessity rather than choice. Your body signals caution. Winter eating is never about strength alone. It is about endurance. You focus on indoor tasks, mending tools, repairing clothing seams weakened by damp cold. Wool holds warmth even when worn thin, but only if cared for. A small tear can become a fatal draft. As you work, you reflect on the monotony of winter meals. Grain, broth, occasionally meat, sometimes cheese, if stores allow. This repetition is not accidental. Familiar food calms the body. Sudden changes cost energy. Medieval diets favored predictability, especially in winter, when digestion itself became a survival task. Mid-morning brings a small indulgence, a spoonful of honey scraped from a sealed jar. Honey is rare now, saved for sickness or ritual, but today you allow it. The sweetness feels almost shocking, like a memory of summer sunlight. It lifts your mood instantly. A fringe belief persists in some regions that honey strengthens resistance to cold. Whether true or not, it strengthens resolve, and that counts. You ration carefully. 1 spoon, no more. Pleasure must never threaten survival. The midday meal is lighter than yesterday's. You sense another fasting period approaching. The calendar is less important than the body's signals and the church's rhythm. Food cycles align with spiritual cycles, whether you feel devout or simply obedient. Abstinence is framed as virtue, but it is also logistics. Less food consumed now means more later. You drink warmed ale or thin beer, common even in winter. It provides calories and safer hydration than raw water. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval people consumed weak alcohol daily, not for intoxication, but for nourishment and safety. You sip slowly, letting warmth spread. Outside, the world is quiet. Snow dampens sound. You feel insulated, enclosed within layers of clothing and routine. Winter narrows life to essentials, stripping away distraction. Eating becomes one of the few remaining pleasures, which makes restraint both harder and more meaningful. In the afternoon, you assist a neighbor briefly, sharing labor rather than food. This exchange preserves dignity and resources. Mutual aid in winter rarely looks like charity. It looks like cooperation. You both know that tomorrow the roles may reverse. Evening approaches, and with it, another smaller meal. This time, no meat. Only grain and fat, stirred patiently. You notice how your palate has adapted. Where once this might have felt insufficient, now it feels normal. Hunger reshapes expectation. As you eat, you think about those who did not prepare well enough. Winter starvation was not dramatic for most. It was gradual, quiet. People faded rather than collapsed. This thought does not frighten you. It sharpens your awareness. You eat slowly, honoring each bite. Before sleep, you tidy the eating space, wiping bowls clean. Residue attracts pests, and pests threaten stores. Even crumbs matter. You bank the fire carefully, adding just enough fuel to survive the night without waste. Lying down, you feel the familiar negotiation between warmth and hunger. Tonight, hunger is subdued. You focus on breathing, on the steady rhythm that mirrors the cycles of eating and fasting you have internalized. Sleep arrives in fragments, but each fragment is deeper than before. Your body trusts that food will return. That trust, built meal by meal, is the true nourishment of winter. You wake before dawn again, not because you are rested, but because your body has learned that winter does not wait for comfort. The cold presses inward during the final hours of night, when the fire has surrendered almost entirely and the stored warmth of yesterday's meals thins like breath on glass. Hunger returns, but it is muted, distant. You have crossed into a different phase of winter living now, one where appetite no longer panics, only reminds. You rise carefully, conserving energy even in movement. The floor bites at your feet, and you briefly regret yesterday's decision to stretch the last embers rather than feed them. But regret is part of the system too. It sharpens future choices. You coax the fire back with practiced patience. There is a rhythm to it now, one learned over weeks rather than days. The smallest splinter first, then a breath, then another. Flames are never rushed. Fire responds poorly to desperation. This morning's food is almost ceremonial in its simplicity. A thin broth, reheated once more, fortified with a final pinch of grain. It is barely a meal by summer standards, but winter has changed the scale. What matters is warmth and continuity. The act of eating is as important as the calories themselves. It signals safety to the body. You sip slowly, letting heat move inward. Medieval people understood something instinctively that modern life often obscures. Digestion requires warmth. Cold bodies waste food. That is why winter meals are hot whenever possible, even if thin. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants consciously understood metabolic efficiency, or whether these practices emerged purely through experience. Either way, the result is survival. As daylight creeps in, you feel the cumulative weight of winter eating. Not abundance, but adequacy. You are thinner than you were in autumn. Everyone is. This is expected. Seasonal weight loss is not failure. It is design. Bodies are meant to contract in winter, reducing needs, conserving strength. Only the very wealthy avoid this cycle, and even they feel winter's drag. Mid-morning brings a rare decision point. You consider whether to open a preserved meat bundle you had hoped to save. The weather is worsening again. Snow threatens to lock you indoors for days. Food planning becomes future-facing now, almost strategic. You weigh risk carefully. You decide against it. Today does not yet demand sacrifice. Instead, you rely on fat. Rendered lard, saved specifically for moments like this. A small spoon stirred into broth transforms it instantly, adding calories and satiety. Fat is winter gold. It burns slow and steady inside you, like a hearth that never fully cools. There is a fringe belief, passed quietly among households, that animal fat consumed before sleep wards off winter illness. Scholars debate whether this belief had any medical basis, or whether it simply encouraged calorie intake during the hardest months. Either way, the practice persists, and tonight you plan to follow it. Work passes quietly. There is little to do now but wait and maintain. Winter eating is paired with winter patience. You mend, clean, and prepare for immobility. You check stores again, counting portions not by days but by storms. The midday meal is skipped entirely today. This is intentional, not forced. Fasting has become part of the rhythm. Your body protests briefly, then settles. Hunger comes in waves now, predictable and manageable. This is adaptation. Medieval winters trained people not to fear hunger, but to negotiate with it. You drink warm liquid instead, water boiled earlier. flavored faintly with herbs saved for health. Warmth substitutes for fullness. It is not a trick. It works. As afternoon fades, the cold intensifies. You eat again before dusk, this time a slightly larger portion. Timing matters. Food eaten before night supports warmth during sleep. This is common knowledge, passed without writing, without theory. Eat before darkness, sleep warmer. The meal is repetitive, almost dull, but comforting in its sameness. Grain, fat, salt. No surprises. Winter rewards predictability. As you chew, you reflect on how food has shifted from pleasure to structure. Each meal is a marker in time, a reassurance that the day has shape. Even scarcity follows rules. Before sleep, you take that promised spoon of fat. It coats your mouth, heavy and oddly satisfying. You follow it with warm liquid, then bank the fire carefully. Lying down, you feel neither full nor empty. You feel sustained. Hunger no longer frightens you. It has become a background hum, like wind against the walls. You pull coverings tighter and breathe steadily. Tomorrow will demand the same restraint, the same quiet negotiations. But tonight, you have eaten enough. And in winter, enough is everything. You wake again in the deep of night, not fully, but enough to register the cold pressing in from all directions. It is the kind of waking that does not involve thought, only sensation. Your body checks the world, confirms that you are still alive, still warm enough, still fed enough to continue. Then it settles back, but lighter now, closer to the surface of sleep. This half-waking has become familiar over winter. It is not insomnia, it is vigilance. Medieval people do not sleep like modern people do, not in long, uninterrupted stretches, but in layers, drifting and resurfacing as the fire dims, as hunger murmurs, as the temperature shifts. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal or simply common during colder months. But your body behaves as if it expects interruption. Your stomach is quiet tonight. That is the clearest sign that you managed food correctly. Hunger does not claw, it does not ache, it rests. This is the reward of restraint earlier in the day. Too much food would have made you restless, overheated briefly, then cold again. Too little would have woken you sharp and shaking. Winter eating is a narrow path, and tonight you walk it well. You adjust slightly, careful not to break the shared warmth. Bodies are closer now than they would ever be in summer. Privacy is a luxury suspended until spring. Heat is communal. Breath fogs faintly in the darkness, mingling, pooling beneath coverings. The air smells of wool, smoke, and the faint, comforting residue of cooked grain. Your mind drifts, and with it comes reflection. Not deliberate, but slow and looping. You think of food not as individual meals, but as a season-long strategy. Every bite eaten weeks ago mattered. Every decision to save, to dry, to salt, to trade. Winter eating is not about tonight alone. It is about cumulative survival. There is a mainstream historical fact that medieval peasants rarely starved outright during average winters. Instead, they endured prolonged undernourishment. This distinction matters. Starvation is sudden and dramatic. Undernourishment is quiet, drawn out, and far more common. It reshapes bodies gradually, it teaches patience, it lowers expectations. You feel that now, in the way your thoughts slow, in the way comfort has been redefined, fullness is no longer the goal. Stability is. At some point, your mouth feels dry. You consider waking fully to drink, but decide against it. Cold air punishes unnecessary movement. You swallow once and let the sensation pass. Medieval advice, spoken, not written, often emphasizes staying still at night to conserve warmth. Movement wastes calories. Calories are food. Food is life. There is a curious fringe belief, recorded much later, by early modern writers, that winter hunger sharpened moral character. That enduring limited food brought people closer to spiritual clarity. Whether medieval peasants believed this themselves is unclear. Scholars debate whether such ideas were imposed retrospectively by clerical elites or genuinely shared. What is clear is that endurance became normalized. Suffering was not romanticized, but it was expected. Your body turns slightly, instinctively seeking the warmest pocket of air. You tuck hands where heat lingers longest. You are half aware of dreams beginning to form. Mundane ones. Fields that offer nothing. Pots simmering endlessly. Bread that never quite arrives. Winter dreams are repetitive, just like winter meals. Eventually, you drift deeper. Time passes without measurement. When you wake again, it is not night anymore. It is that thin gray moment before dawn, when cold is at its sharpest. The fire is nearly gone. The world is holding its breath. Your stomach stirs, not urgently, but insistently. Hunger has returned, right on schedule. This is not failure. This is the rhythm reasserting itself. You have made it through another cycle. Day, night, cold, restraint, rest. You lie still for a moment longer, gathering resolve. You know exactly what you will do when you rise. Fire first. Warmth before food, then eating, slow and deliberate, as the day begins again. There is no sense of triumph in this, only continuity. Medieval winter eating is not about heroism. It is about repetition. The same foods, the same decisions, over and over, until spring loosens its grip. Survival is cumulative. Each adequate night builds on the last. As you finally move, you feel tired, but not defeated. Thin, but functioning. Hungry, but prepared. This is what winter allows, and what it demands. You rise, ready to begin again, knowing that today's choices will quietly shape tomorrow night's rest, just as yesterday shaped this one. And somewhere deep in your body, beneath hunger and cold alike, there is a steady confidence now. You know how to eat winter. You know how to last. Sweet dreams.